I'm speaking in good faith today with Kathleen Messina, who's the director of the Spiritual Direction Institute, part of the Emmaus Spirituality Center. Kathleen, you're coming to us from Missouri City, Texas. Tell people where Missouri City is.
Well, Missouri City is in the greater Houston area. And if your listeners are at all familiar with that, it is in the far southwest, below Sugar Land, which is a place many people are familiar with.
Well, you're in a huge city, a giant metroplex, one of the biggest in the nation. Kathleen is an active minister in her parish, St. Angela Merici, the Catholic Church in Missouri City, where she coordinates and supervises spiritual direction and leads other spiritual life ministries, including Legion of Mary, Readings and Spirituality Book Club, and serves as a Eucharistic minister to the sick and homebound. There are a few other things we've learned about you that will come up in the questions, but you're a busy woman.
I am busy. I'm getting a little too old for that, Steve.
Well, I want to tell you I want to ask you how you became, first of all, interested in spiritual direction at all, because that had to happen before you became a director in the different situations where you do it.
Yes, in a formal sense, I was not familiar with it at all until the last 15 or 16 years. I'd certainly visited with my priests at time to time when I was going through things, but I wasn't aware of it as a ministry, and certainly one that lay people participated in. But when I moved here to Missouri City, a new parish was being formed, and the pastor at the time was very interested in making spiritual direction available in this new parish. And so he would see me at daily mass and from time to time would ask me, what are you going to do around here? And eventually, and I kept ducking him. And then eventually he said to me, really, I would like you to consider formation as a spiritual director. And so that was really the beginning of all of this. In some ways,
for our listeners who aren't Catholic, how would you describe formation?
Formation is, another word that probably wouldn't make sense. It's more than just teaching. So I was going to say catechesis. It's more than teaching. It means it involves a change in the whole person, a transformation. So we are formed, not just trained, for example.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So continue. You started thinking about this. I might actually do what he says. And then what happened?
And it was quite a shift for me. I'd had a career in community and economic development for years, and I was already a grandmother. So it was a serious consideration to enter 3 years of formation at the Spiritual Direction Institute. And at the same time, I also went back to Fordham University in New York to receive a master's from their Graduate School of Religion. So again, it was something I wasn't, familiar with, but it grew into something that was really attracting me first for myself, because it opened this whole new world to me. And I just loved the learning, the training, and it became a real call then.
For lots of us who are lay people, we open the scripture, we go to our services, we try and serve where we can. And obviously we're trying to be like Jesus and follow what he taught, what we've been asked. And that's kind of our religious life. But the idea of an academic aspect to that, like where you go and study more, what did that add to your spiritual life?
It just added such great depth, a kind of like you say, Steve, we go along with what we know, but there was a whole world out of there that then opened up, in a sense, explanations to things I felt or saw about God and experienced that no one in the pulpit had ever talked about. It opened up the whole idea of even getting away, going on a retreat. That wasn't something I'd done since high school, and I didn't know adults did that. I thought it was just a requirement. And so it really did change. It really did deepen my relationship with the Lord into something that became less of a performance, right, into a joy and a relationship and a friendship.
Well, that sounds how faith should be.
Right,
Less
right.
of the checklist and more of something that builds
Yes.
our spirits, even in difficult moments. And then you went on to become, let me say that again. Then you went on to become a chaplain. Was
Yes.
that basically the same work under a different name, or is it a different thing?
It's certainly in the same family, I would say. Um, and I arrived at that quite unexpectedly as well. I had been involved, obviously, in a lot of ministries, and then I had some disappointments and decided it was time for a retreat. And I went on retreat. And at that time, I wasn't seeking anything. I wasn't looking for a new direction. I just wanted to rest with the Lord, maybe lick my wounds, like we sometimes need to do. And then it came to me, come to the jail. And it was preposterous sounding to me. It was just so unexpected. In one sense, had been always very involved in concern and ministry to the poor and marginalized. But even as, and I had a weekly bulletin column that was an explanation of the Sunday scriptures that I did for about 14 years at St. Angela's. And I remember one year, early on in that, in the lectionary cycle, the Matthew 25 had come up. And so as I'm reflecting on that, I said, definitely we can see Christ the King in the poor, the hungry, the naked, but I don't know so much about those in jail. I'd actually written that. And so God has a really funny sense of humor and said, come see me there too. And so I brought it to my spiritual director. She said, you want to stick with that for a while. And I did. And eventually found my way to the Archdiocesan Office of Correctional Ministries and began serving as a chaplain in the Harris County Jail in 2013.
I think you just said something hugely important, which is, so Matthew 25, famous chapter where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who fed me, who clothed me, who visited me, and
Right.
saw me in prison. And when did we see thee? When you did it unto one of the least of these." And then the flip side, when did we not do those things? That idea of learning to see Christ or see Jesus in other people, and I would say from people of whole other faith traditions, maybe learning to see the divine in another person. What has that meant to you? How do you see Jesus or see Christ in the people that you minister to or work with?
There's two things I probably want to say about that, Steve. The first is, I think, part of the spiritual journey is to, first of all, recognize that Christ dwells within me, right? So if I come to that place in my faith and my appreciation for Christ's presence in me, then it's even possible to believe that Christ dwells in others. But you're right, it's often a leap, because particularly those who are probably even more active, quite frankly, in their faith tradition, we can be, I don't want to say do-gooders, but we're good people and we're trying to help. We can easily imagine ourselves as Christ, right?
Being
But
his hands and his feet in doing his work.
Absolutely. And yet to really embrace the other, the one who I'm angry at, in a very real sense, forget about the jail, just the relative I'm angry at, or the person who has slighted me, or the minister who forgets my name, or any of those kinds of things. And then, of course, in addition to those who are mentioned in Matthew 25. But those can also, be spiritualized to the very people who are right in front of our face.
When you think of young Kathleen as a child, growing up, figuring out, do I believe all of these things I'm being taught? Are you surprised where you have ended up? Or would she be surprised?
Actually, not so much. Um, as a little girl, I am Roman Catholic, and I was raised in a Catholic family. So our Catholicism was our religion, our faith, our culture. I went to Catholic school, and so this is in the late 1950s. We had a catechism, and the first question in the catechism is, why did God make me? Right? Mm-hmm. God made me to know, love, and serve him in this world. So I've always been an intensive listener. So that's the first thing. So I'd listen to that, and it said, God made me. That's a very personal experience. And now how do I know, love, and serve him in this world? So in my, very young child, it was always part of my thinking, part of how I tried to respond to life circumstances. And then I was also really fortunate. You ask if I believe it or not. I was really fortunate in Catholic school that I had religious sisters who allowed me in particular to ask questions. And I'd ask questions all the time. And I remember one day, this is in the 5th grade, Sister Jean Mary got a little weary because we had a lot of kids in each of those classes. And she said to me, Kathleen, I'm starting to think you're a doubting Thomas. Well, that did not sound good to 5th grader Kathleen. So I go, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And what was so fascinating about that is at lunchtime, I'm in line to go into the cafeteria. And this little sister comes up to me and she pulls me out of the line. She said, I am so sorry that I said that. You can ask anything you want whenever you want. And so that's always given me a lot of freedom in my exploration of faith, to be unafraid of my questions and my doubts and to give them room. And within that, when I had that kind of freedom, I didn't, like many, ever have a period. I had periods where I'm certainly angry at God or frustrated, wondering where God is. But I never said, I'm done with God or I'm done with the church. I never had that kind of an experience.
As far as having a personal connection, a feeling connected to God, which was really well explained when you said he made me, and that struck you as such a personal thing. In your life since, are there experiences or events that have become touchstones to you, like, I believe because of this has confirmed my belief in the reality of the divine?
I don't know if this works, but for you. But what comes to my mind is, in the middle of all this formation that I was going through, I also got cancer. And it was a very serious cancer with a very poor prognosis. And at the time, I discovered that time to be my closest time ever with the Lord. I had gone into it quite surprised I was sick. I didn't anticipate that at all. And I was not afraid of death because, as I reflected on my life at the time, I said, well, all my relationships are in pretty good shape. So I think I'm good to go.
Literally.
And it was a very long and difficult haul for me and for my family and for all those who love me. And God's faithfulness in that and in other really challenging times have certainly reassured me of that there is a God and that I can trust this God.
So you find yourself later, thank you, by the way, and I'm so glad about how things have turned out. You find yourself now in a prison ministry, meeting the people that you had once written, it's 50-50.
Right,
I'm on the fence about these
right,
folks.
right, right.
Um, but has it helped that you've been through a few things like cancer?
Yes, I do think, that our suffering in whatever form that it takes helps us in standing alongside others who suffer, regardless of the reason or what it is or what it is not. Yeah, I think it definitely does. And the fact that I have, because I grew up in a loving family, and I have felt love, it helps me be unafraid to share that love and to not be afraid, but to have such compassion for those who have not, whose lives have been lacking in so many ways, and to be, compassionate and empathetic with where they find themselves.
I'm wondering about the difference between a jail and a prison. Do you have people
Mm,
moving through more quickly in a jail? Maybe they've been arrested or they're up for trial or something like that. I guess
mhm.
I'm asking, do you have I'm resisting saying a captive audience, but that comes to mind. Is there a static group like a prison might be, or is a jail more people coming in and out?
Mhm. Certainly, that when people are in prison, they've received their sentence and they're there for whatever designated amount of time that requires. But people stay in the jail an unjust amount of time, actually.
Hmm.
The movement there is not what you would think. Um, Last year, I mean, one person whom I'm accompanying right now, she's been there 4 years awaiting trial.
Oh my goodness.
Right. Someone that just was released last year had been there 5 years awaiting trial. So those are the most extreme cases. But I minister to women, right? So although there are 10,000 people in Harris County Jail, it's the third largest in the country. Um, only about 1,100 are women. And if you're there for a really serious capital offense. And so, or aggravated offense rather. And so, moving through the court system is, can be very slow, as just because there's a lot of details there, but also because there are those that benefit from resetting dates or making it slower necessarily than it needs to be. And so that's a political discussion. But to your question, I do have people that are there, most times at least 6 months to a year. So
Okay.
that I do have time with them because I meet with them, as I say, once a week.
So you get to know them and you can establish a relationship. Maybe this is a weird question, but because you work outside of the jail in spiritual direction with people and formation, and then you're working inside, is there some difference in what you do and how you do what you do between those two groups?
Mhm. It's an interesting question, Steve, and I was reflecting on it, and it's actually less of a difference than you might think. Um, in one sense, in all the cases where I minister, certainly spiritual direction in the parish, as an instructor and director of the program, and as a chaplain in the jail, I'm bringing myself. That's the first thing, and hopefully a self who is enough self emptied that I can receive, whatever, provide a holding place for other people's stories, their situations, and so forth. So it's really to make room for them. And the other commonality is that in some sense, the questions that seekers pose, whether they're in the jail or anywhere, really have a universality to them, as well as a very significant particularity. So they are concerned, in my case with the women, they're concerned about, you know, um, how their children are.
Right.
How did I end up here? What's going to happen next? Does God see me? Those are questions that really transcend location.
It sounds like, despite circumstances, people are people.
Yes, yeah.
Have you felt, and you can decide whether you feel comfortable with any of these questions, are there times you have felt inspired or had thoughts or suggestions or something come into your mind to assist someone that you were working with and trying to serve?
When I was inspired, um, for one thing, I will tell you, I am inspired by the resiliency that that sometimes rises to the surface, particularly in the people that I've been with so very long. To give you an example, a young woman named Alita was arrested after a gang shooting. So she was 17 years old when she came into the jail and pregnant. And while there, she gave birth. And fortunately, her parents took the child. So that was quite a blessing. When Alita came in, she was very combative, like most inmates. She said, I don't belong here. I never did anything. She said, I never even spent a night away from my parents. I told her I doubted that. But she eventually began to slow down. And that's what people often do. And boy, the world needs to slow down. But I get to observe it in the jail. So Alita eventually began to slow down a little bit. And she was forced to do that because she actually, after she gave birth, she was put in solitary confinement for the next 4.5 years, where she would only have 1 hour out of her cell a day. And it would be at a random hour. So in all that time when I would visit her and I would bring her Holy Communion, I would talk through a little window in a metal door, right? And I would have to I would give her Holy Communion, and I would have to slide that through the crack, and her fingers would meet mine to take it. That was in one sense, the ridiculous, distance between us, but also generated incredible closeness. And so all through that time, as she tried to make sense of what she was doing there, I saw this huge transformation where by the time that she got out, after having been there for 5 years, she emerged as a woman of great faith who believed God was not punishing her there, but protecting her from herself, not just from the gang activity, but from herself and her inclinations of rebellion. She grew to love her parents. Her only desire was to raise her child, whom she named Genesis. And so that's inspiring to me about the ability to hold still long enough to let God work in me. We talk about St. John's dark night of the soul, right? And so often we want to get out of the darkness, but to just let God work on us and to cooperate with that work. I mean, there's grace and then there's the acceptance of it. And so she had a receptivity to that grace and just emerged a different person, a different mother, a different daughter than she would ever had she not been incarcerated.
Wow. To cooperate with that work. And that's in the dark night of the soul. That can be a difficult choice, it would seem to me.
Yes.
Did you have some of that in your time with cancer? Because I'm assuming it involved pain and treatments and just a total disruption of your usual life.
Actually, Steve, not so much there because, as I say, when I was in a good place to enter that and to try to be a witness for Christ in that illness with my family and among our community. My illness for me, it was still a very small parish, and the people, it raised questions for them. How could she get cancer? why would God do that to her? And that's where they were in their faith. That's not where I was in my faith. But I have experienced it in situations where I've really entered in a period of being deeply misjudged or misunderstood. When I was a young woman, one of the earlier times when I was a young woman, I worked for Catholic Charities. I was the director of advancement in the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I got fired. And I got fired, as I like to tell it at the time, not so much anymore, because I was making too much money for them. and that's certainly not the whole story, and I'm not going to go into that. But it threw me into a deep darkness because I felt, so I'm in my 30s at that point, and I think I'm with the Lord. I'm doing the Lord's work, building transitional facilities, involving all sorts of things. And so how could I be removed from that job? And it really led me into a deep questioning about the authorities in the church and their priorities. It led me into a lot of reflection about, well, what am I called to do here or not? And so it did not take a long time, but it was an excruciatingly painful time. As I tried to just accept it and then to allow myself to see what God had planned for me next.
Thank you. There are so many people in the area of the Houston area. It's just a gigantic area, and there are people of all different faiths, all different traditions. So when you are being a chaplain, or especially, do people of all different traditions, what do you hold on to when you work with them that is your own denomination or your own faith, and what do you let go of? And maybe that's not even the right way of phrasing it. So when you work with people, if you work with Muslims, if you work with Hindus, if you work with people of evangelical denominations within Christianity, what is it that you bring as a spiritual resource, as a chaplain, to all of those people?
Mm-hmm. Well, to begin with, when I enter a pod or a tank, as it's commonly conceived, I invite everyone to come pray. I don't say, "Oh, can the Catholics come over now?" And so everyone is invited. So I'm not checking faith tradition or not. So you're right. People are just welcome, a presence in the tank or in the pod. And so they will often, you're right, people of many, but it will be predominantly Christian faiths. We're here in Texas, and that's, pretty overwhelming in this area. But certainly from a wide variety of traditions. And I don't find that I don't have to promote my faith, nor do I have to hide it. And so it's so great. Actually, this is actually a pretty funny story. So years ago, because I like to focus on the Sunday scripture, after I come in and I see how everybody's doing, get a temperature on where their lives have gone in the last week, good or not so great. And then I like to focus on the Sunday scripture from the Common Lectionary, because all Christians of mainline Christians share that lectionary. And so I tell them, if you were home going to your church, this is the gospel that you would hear. And I always invite one of them to read it. I don't read it. I don't need to serve as a formal minister in that regard. And then we talk about it, right? So this one time, it was on the baptism of Jesus, right? And so I said, oh my goodness, I bet a lot of you were not baptized as infants, as most Catholics are, right? And so, so they all started telling stories about their baptisms, and it was really so great. So then what was kind of funny is, so this one woman whose uncle was a priest, she was sitting next to me. This is a long time ago. And she said, I have some holy water. why don't we bless one another? So I said, well, I think that's a fabulous idea. So she got her holy water, and I invited everyone to come up, and I just made the sign of the cross on their forehead. Okay, I'm not like thinking sacramentally or anything. And afterwards, there was a grievance filed against me because the perception was I was trying to baptize people as Catholics.
Oh,
And that was it was just so great. But oftentimes it just it's an interaction, with their understanding of their faith, or places where there's an intersection, particularly as it relates to the Old Testament or to the stories. It's just a very positive experience to be able to be there gathered without having to, I'm certainly not there to convert anyone. I do only offer Holy Communion to the Catholics because, for the very reason, the perception would be that I'm trying to convert. There's a particular belief, and I'm not trying to convert anybody.
right. In working with people in spiritual direction, and this may apply in chaplaincy as well, one question we had is, are there some categories of things or ways of thinking that block us from becoming spiritually connected? Maybe we hold ourselves back. What do you think as you work with people?
I do, because of the joy that I receive through my own relationship with God, and I see in others. It is a question that I wonder about. And particularly because we know that we are created and exist in relationship, right? So why do we avoid the one that would be most life-giving, our relationship with God? Karl Rahner, who was a 20th century German theologian, famously said that the Christian of the future will either be a mystic or will cease to be anything at all, right? And he means that they have not experienced something. Unless we have experienced God, you're going to give up on faith because it's just going to be a head trip. So while I think that religious doctrine and the catechesis that we do, that teaching stuff, is really important, that's not what convinced the followers of Jesus, right? I mean, he did teach them, but they followed him to his death, more or less, and certainly after his resurrection and ascension. They went to their own martyrdom, but by the conviction of their experience of Jesus, not an individual teaching. And so the question for me becomes, how do we help people with that experience? And the other thing, John, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10, I came that you may have life and live abundantly. And it is kind of a shame that in our world so mitigates against that risking of the way of the cross. So I think that's one of the things that so often gets in the way of people really connecting to God. They will not risk that. And I think also what gets in the way is that we have a distorted idea about freedom, and we're so rooted in individualism. And I think that leads us to rebel against the invitations of God, of getting closer to him. And so instead of drawing closer, connecting, people have other substitutes. They have so many other substitutes that they think will satisfy them, and they don't. I think a lot of people are afraid of what, if they get close to the Lord, what will that demand? So I think, when we look at our world, that's why there's this epidemic of loneliness and anxiety and fear and anger and competitiveness that's just so not of God. So when I ask myself, well, what can we do about that? What can we do to reach those people? When people first come to me for spiritual direction, one of the things I will say to them is, what brings you here now?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so often something will come up, they have finally this awareness of a desire for more than they have. They, other things have failed them and they want more. They want the relationship with God. And so that will bring people to spiritual direction. But we would hope that others who, don't, haven't yet reached that would be inspired to begin to identify the deeper hunger, the deeper desire that they have. And I think that is where our evangelization comes in. We call the gospel the good news, right? The good news of Jesus Christ, right? And yet, I think the best thing we can do is to radiate that truth. However we do it, wherever we go in our lives, to be witnesses of what Pope Francis calls the joy of the gospel, actually. I think it becomes contagious. I think people begin to I want what she has. Quite frankly, even when I was a young woman and I had these two little girls, and I'm struggling and I'm thinking, how am I going to work? And what am I going to do in my life? And there was a woman at Mass who I'd see her and she had 8 kids. And I would say, how does she do it? She looks so peaceful all the time, and and her kids, her 8 were better behaved than my 2. And, and so I got to know her, and she was a person of extreme faith. And so again, I wanted that. And so that was a great lesson to me. I'd forgotten about that at the time. And I think, again, wherever we go, whatever we do, we want to love others as we've been loved. If we can share that love. I just came from 4 days away with my siblings. There are 7 of us still living, and our spouses went on a little trip, and we live all over the country. And so on Sunday, we gathered. Mass wasn't available where we are, but we gathered, and we took time to express our gratitude for all those who had come before us, all those whose lives had impacted us, the love that we had received that helped us become the people who we are. If we can get in touch with that gratitude, it's so helpful. Instead of trying to acquire, be grateful for what we have. I think you at times can get a little weary wondering, what separates so many people, from God, and how beneficial that would be for the world. And I tell myself, I'm not going to give up. I'm just going to remain steadfast. And I often just take my mind to a place in the second letter of Peter where and it's in my breviary, so it comes around, and where it says that the Lord's patience is directed towards salvation. So I know this will not be over until we are all one, that there is no division between our faiths or between families or the Lord has said there is one group, and I am not going to lose anyone. So I leave it to him and do what I can.
Well, thank you so much. I've learned so much from speaking with you. And as far as seeing somebody else who then motivates you, your joy in what you do motivates me. So thank you for spreading that. Here's a question, maybe just a final one. And you can tell me, do Catholics ask each other this or not? Is it appropriate for me to ask? Because I find myself wondering, Is there a particular saint who has become a touchstone or a very meaningful figure in your religious life?
Hmm.
And maybe the answer is no, or I haven't thought about it much, or, or I have no idea.
Well, yeah, I have a variety of go-to saints. Um, and Catholics do ask, and we promote that. We do
Okay.
promote talking about the saints and their lives. I said something while I was on this trip about Elizabeth Ann Seton and how she was a convert. She was, I think, the first American born saint. And because my aunt was a religious sister of charity, she had us as kids praying for her canonization. And, but how she had gone over because her husband had tuberculosis and went over to Italy for him to be cared for. He died, but she was so loved by the sisters. Again, the love, she came back. But anyway, for myself, one saint I often go to is Saint Teresa of Avila because of her passion for the transformation of the religious orders and of the church to be really more Christ-like and in line with who Jesus was. And so for the restoration of the religious orders, and she had a particular prayer that she kept in her breviary that I will often pray. And it just begins, let nothing trouble you, let nothing frighten you. Everything passes. Only God will never change. And it goes on from there. So she's an important one for me. But increasingly for me, quite frankly, is our Blessed Mother. She's a saint.
Hmm.
So I love Mary. I mentioned that my mother was not, maybe I didn't. Was a convert. And so Mary was not as talked about in our home as in many Catholic homes she might have been. And yet over the years, I've had an increasing devotion to her and trying to imitate her way of pondering, her way of surrender, her way of never giving up, really staying with her son and
Yeah.
allowing. I'm going to
She
be
did do
offering,
all of those things.
yes, I'm going to be giving an Advent retreat. And I decide because people so often they want to do the will of God, right? But they don't really know what that is. And so I'm giving the retreat out of when Mary said, when the angel came to her, she said, let it be done to me according to thy will. And so I'm going to build on that and tell them, that God's will is not something separate from our own will. Actually, he's using me, the who I am, in the best that I am, and all my, quite frankly, even my weaknesses, to transform the world. So to encourage them in that.
Kathleen Messina is the director of the Spiritual Direction Institute, part of the Emmaus Spirituality Center, and is also, this is in Missouri City, Texas, where she is also a chaplain at the Harris County Jail. Kathleen, it's been a delight to speak with you today. Thanks for sharing your faith with me in good faith.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a real privilege. I really appreciate it.